want to present today, this panel is part of the new Studio X Global Research Series that is titled Security Regimes. It examines global spaces of exception. The series was launched last week in Istanbul with the exhibition Compressed Guantánamos, and it will be followed by a series of panel discussions under the theme, The Hidden Histories of Cities, and a publication documenting prisons in Turkey. Today we will talk about the gathering and reconstruction of data regarding US drone strikes. So why Studio X is interested in drone strikes as spaces of exception, and how this relates to architecture. With this series, we aim for an understanding of architecture in an expanded context of the spatial politics, and we want to interrogate how architects could take part in the debate as spatial consultants and in the intersection of legal and physical environments. We also want to understand how architects, together with other practitioners, could contribute to this debate with the production of evidence, and how to, at least with the representation of these zones of indeterminacy between the legal and illegal, state and law, war and peace, and law and evidence. This event is a collaboration with the Studio X New York and Bard Center for the Study of the Drone, and it will be followed by a publication by the Center for the Study of the Drone, the New Institute in Rotterdam, and the publishing house DPR Barcelona, which will include materials for tonight's panel and also from a seminar that will take place in Rotterdam in May. We are extremely excited about working with all of them, and I'm very grateful to Dan Gettinger and Arthur Holland Mitchell, for founders and co-editors of Center for the Study of the Drone, for sharing their expertise on drones with us. The center is a site of reference for the interdisciplinary study of drones, which seeks to contribute to the development of sensible policies to govern drones use. Please join me in welcoming Arthur Holland Mitchell, co-founder and editor of the Center for the Study of the Drone, who will introduce our fantastic panelists, Brad Samuels from C2 Research, Noreen Shah, American Civil Liberties Union, and Josh Phegley, Metadata. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marina and Carlos. As she said, I'm Arthur Holland Michel. I'm the co-director of the Center for the Study of the Drone at Bard. We are very, very excited to be taking part in this collaboration with Studio X. Tonight we're here to talk about how to deal with what is a deeply imperfect data set. So we have a targeted killing regime that has been going on for over a decade now, but we don't have reliable data because the US government chooses not to release it. And so to illustrate that fact, I wanted to pass a couple of sort of figures by you, and then we'll sort of, by way of sort of giving us some context, I guess, and then we can get into the discussion. So there are three organizations that really look at the statistics from drone strikes: the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, the New America Foundation, and the Long War Journal. They count civilian casualties, and they count them as a proportion of the total casualties from drone strikes. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism says that it's between 12% and 35% civilian casualties. The New America Foundation between 8 and 15%, whereas the Long War Journal puts it at 6%. That really gives you a sense of how imperfect the data is. Those ranges are so large so as to make the data almost abstract in a sense. And so we're here to think about how to deal with that, how to represent that data, and how to actually have a substantive conversation given these limitations. So with that in mind, we have three people here who have three very different methodologies for how to approach the issue. Noreen Shah is the Legislative Counsel at the American Civil Liberties Union. She has been involved in several very influential reports on drone warfare, both with Amnesty International and the Human Rights Clinic at Columbia University. Brad is a partner at C2 Research, and he was very much involved in C2's work developing an online platform to present UN Special Rapporteur Ben Emerson's recent report on drone strikes. And finally, we have Josh Phegley, who is a data artist and who is responsible for Drone Stream, which you may have heard of. In 2012, Josh decided to tweet every single drone strike that had ever happened. It took him a little bit longer than he thought it was going to take, but it drew a lot of attention to the issue. He is also the creator of Metadata, which is an app for tracking drone strikes. So three very different methodologies. We're going to have a discussion after each person has sort of spoken a little bit about their background and what they've done, and then we'll open it up to the audience and have a bit of a Q&A session. If that sounds good, maybe Noreen, we can pass it over to you.
But before joining the ACLU, I worked at Amnesty International USA, and I helped work on a report about drone strikes that was released this fall called Will I Be Next, about drone strikes in Pakistan. I was also involved when I worked at Columbia University in two reports about how we count and assess drone strike killings. So what I'd like to do is just provide you a little bit of context. Why are we all so obsessed about visualizing and collecting data on drone strike killings? What does it really matter to the larger debate on drones? And then I want to tell you a little bit about the approach that we took at Amnesty to documenting and presenting the research that we did. If you think about it, we know that there have been about more than 4,000 people killed in drone strikes, more than 400 drone strikes, and a lot of them occurring since about 2008 under the Bush administration and the Obama administration. So we have these kind of raw numbers. What the idea of determining who these people are has been critical to our ability to discuss them, because the larger context is a debate about who's being killed. And I'm a human rights lawyer. So many things that we talk about on human rights law are categorically abusive. If you told me 400 people were disappeared or kidnapped, and that 4,000 people had been tortured, I could tell you, well, those were all that was a mass case of human rights violations. But if you tell me that 4,000 people have been killed, and they've been killed in a part of the world where there is armed conflict, in Afghanistan, where there are armed groups locally operating, it's a more complicated story. It's not just a case of a human rights abuse. It could be a case of a justifiable killing. But here's the problem. The Obama administration, in waging a pretty extensive campaign of airstrikes, has tried to maintain secrecy overall about who is being killed. And instead of explaining who's being killed in terms of providing the data, they've told a story. And the narrative is essentially that the right people are being killed and everyone else is doing fine, except in a few instances that they won't disclose. So I just want to briefly mention the kind of three periods of time that I've witnessed as an advocate working on these issues and as a researcher with regard to reporting on drone strike killings. The first, starting in around 2009 and 2010, were scattered reports about drone strikes that were occurring in increasing frequency that really alerted a lot of us in the community that something was going on here, that it wasn't just a kind of spillover from the Afghanistan conflict, but something different. And during that time, all we really had to rely on was media reports. These are reports that were filed by stringers, by journalists who were operating in part of the area where drone strikes occur, but they weren't necessarily even getting access to the places, to the scenes of the kind of crimes, if you will. And what we'd have there is maybe 3 or 4 stringers working and providing details to a national or international media outlet, and say 3 of those journalists say, okay, 5 people were killed, they were all militants. But one of those journalists says, actually, that many people were killed, but some of them may have been civilians. The story that you would see reported in the Associated Press and eventually in the New York Times was that everyone who was killed was a militant. And that even that term militant itself was not really queried until recently. The second stage was the development of what we've already referred to a little bit here, these databases of who's being killed. So the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, the Long War Journal, and New America Foundation decided to take all of those scattered media reports and put them into a database and tell a story about the overall number of people being killed and who those people were. And this is when the Obama administration starts to go on an assault of these journalists and of the notion that civilians are being killed. So we start seeing databases with numbers that I'm sure others here will go over. And instead of saying that, okay, a few people have been killed, 40 people have been killed who are civilians, or 50 people have been killed, the administration starts saying 0 people have been killed. So instead of credible reports about civilian deaths leading the administration to acknowledge that, okay, these are the particular people who were killed, we see the opposite. We see denial, which is actually not uncommon. When Amnesty, when other human rights groups confront governments about human rights abuses, they usually either deny that the abuse is happening or say that the people who have been abused deserved it. And in this case, we really see both, right? We see they were not willing to provide the facts, and they say that most of the people who have been killed are senior members of Al-Qaeda. The third stage in drone strike reporting is really, in the last few years, we've seen organizations like the Associated Press and particular journalists devote a lot of resources to doing on-the-ground investigations themselves and providing really strong documentation of particular drone strikes. And so that's what Amnesty International decided to do for our most recent, I say our, but I no longer work there, for the most recent report that the Amnesty did. Amnesty looked into 45 strikes that happened between January 2012 and August 2013. And of those 45 strikes, we were able to document in depth 9 particular ones. And of those 9, 4 of them raised serious concerns about violations of the right to life. I just wanted to tell you, I don't know how much context you have if you've ever sat down and read an Amnesty report, probably not, but just to really briefly give you a sense of the kind of documentation we do. So we don't look for the hard numbers. We're trying to show documentation of particular instances and put those to the government and say, well, you can continue to deny large scale and say that the numbers that others are basing their assessments on are wrong, but can you deny the facts that we have detailed with satellite imagery, with video, with sending in multiple teams to interview people? Can you deny that? So this is what we would do. This is the killing of a grandmother named Mamana Bibi. Just very briefly read it to you. Mamana Bibi, age 68, was tending her crops in Gundikala village on the afternoon of October 24, 2012, when she was killed instantly by 2 Hellfire missiles fired from a drone aircraft. She was standing in our family fields gathering okra to cook that evening, recalled Zubair Rahman, one of her grandsons, who was standing about 119 feet away, working in fields at the time. Her 3 granddaughters, Nabila, aged 8, Asma, aged 7, and Naima, aged 5, were also in the field, around 115 and 92 feet away from their grandmother. Around 92 feet to the south, another one of Mamana Bibi's grandsons was walking home from school. Accustomed to seeing drones overhead, the grandchildren continued their daily routine. We had grown so used to them flying over our village all the time, Zubair said. Then, before her family's eyes, Mamana Bibi was blown into pieces by at least 2 Hellfire missiles fired concurrently from a U.S. drone aircraft. There was a very bad smell, and the area was full of smoke and dust. I couldn't breathe properly for several minutes. The explosion was very close to us. It was strong, and it pushed me to the ground. She ventured to where her grandmother was picking vegetables earlier in the day. Quote, I saw her shoes. We saw her mutilated body a short time afterwards. It had been thrown quite a long distance away by the blast, and it was in pieces. We collected as many different parts from the field as we could and wrapped them in a cloth. And that testimony goes on, and that's the kind of testimonial method of human rights reports that we try to humanize the people that we're talking about. So we're no longer talking about categories of civilians and militants, but we're talking about children and a grandmother and really brutal things like body parts. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to talk more about our method later on.
I'll talk about that in a minute. Just by way of introduction, so for the past 3 years or so, we've been working on a project called the Forensic Architecture Project, which is being run out of Goldsmiths College, London. And it's a project which, broadly speaking, looks at how data visualization, spatial analysis, the tools kind of native to architecture, art, filmmaking, et cetera, can be leveraged in the service of human rights in international law. And it's a sort of very speculative project in that sense, because it it seeks to kind of marry two fields, or three fields, and sometimes more, who otherwise wouldn't be working with each other. So each case proceeds as very much applied research, in the sense that each case we work on is a real case. It's something that's a constellation of usually a human rights organization and a legal counsel, and then ourselves or another artist or architect from the team. And the one I'll talk about today was the one specifically focused on drone strikes. So this project we did for Ben Emerson. Some of you may know he just recently released his final report on civilian casualties from drone strikes. He's the UN Special Rapporteur on counterterrorism. And the report was really about trying to identify 30 specific strikes in which there's reason to inquire further into civilian deaths. And this is kind of what you typically see as an outcome for a report, or for the UN Special Rapporteur's activity at the end of a 9-month or 12-month research period, where they do a very deep dive into the subject. It's a sort of a PDF. It's usually long form. It's textual, and it's read, I would say, partially because of the format it's in, by folks who are very knowledgeable in the subject, policy folks, academics. It's not necessarily the most accessible format. And what Ben was interested in doing was taking this information and releasing it in two kind of parallel ways. One is the kind of conventional way, and the other is to kind of do it in a multimedia platform, and to leverage, and we'll talk about what data means, but leverage all the different types of formats that were used or could be used or might be helpful in understanding the circumstances surrounding each individual strike he was interested in. So what he does is he sort of calls out in the report the fact that there's this auxiliary website, basically, which one can go to, which hosts all the same textual information. It's Ben's text, but then couples it with all sorts of auxiliary, I call it data, but it's photographs, it's spreadsheets, it's videos, it's testimony, it's anything and everything. So the task for us was really to design a platform, design a vehicle that allowed us to synthesize or grab and pull and represent any and all possible types of information. And I think because it's so hard to get data on the ground, as was just mentioned, every strike site's going to have different type of documentation, or there'll be a dearth of documentation. And so where possible, you can click on a strike, and then you can pull up anything that might be relevant to understanding what happened. Pieces, fragments of munitions. In some cases, it's really just about establishing with certainty where the strike exactly occurred. Because one of the most interesting things to start off with, I'll just zoom through this, was when we first started this project, we were sitting in a sort of initial meeting with BIJ, Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and Reprieve, which is another organization that does really important research on drone strikes. And we said we want to work on this Dada Kell strike. And we had 3 different organizations with 3 different GPS coordinates, all within like 6 kilometers. But if you want to drill in and think about this as high resolution as possible, you first have to actually determine the site with certainty. So this was actually an interesting moment, because it forced the conversation. Like, where did this actually occur? And then it prompted, the decision, yes, we should spend $400 buying satellite imagery. And yes, we should get someone on the ground to corroborate certain things. And we were, through that process and that need to actually identify a certain site, we were able to sort of zone in on the right site. And now they all sort of agree that this is in fact where it occurred. This happens to be the site for that strike. But this was frequently the case. In some cases, it's actually not possible to determine with certainty. You could say it's a village of this name, but you can't say exactly where the strike occurred. But in many cases, you can. But my point is that discussion, that debate, that effort is sometimes prompted by the need to examine things at higher resolution. And this is just to show you the different types of information, different types of data we were using. So before and after satellite images, sometimes which actually showed definitively the destroyed buildings, sometimes didn't. This is a case where it certainly did. But here, for example, also, even to just say that this is the site, we were looking at network television footage of taken on the ground and looking at street patterns and sizes of buildings, and then trying to look back at satellite imagery and cross-reference, the heights of shadows and things like that to say, in fact, where this occurred. Photographs taken on the ground to provide sort of context, greater context. These are just examples of that. Photographs of strike sites themselves. This is in Gaza. I should also say Ben's report was not just about U.S. drone strikes. It was about drone strikes in general, and so there were many countries focused on, and strikes by both the Israeli military and the U.S. military were talked about. And then, at all scales and all level of detail. Anything and everything, I think, is the point I'm trying to make here. Pieces of munitions, circuit boards. And Ben was also emphatic that the work had a human face. In other words, it was important to establish the victims wherever possible and present them in whatever way we could, for the same reason that was just talked about. It can quickly become very abstract and very sort of. We can quickly move away from the fact that we're talking about civilian casualties when we talk about data. This is just to show you the network footage that was used. As was mentioned, a lot of news sources are often referred to and are a great resource, but sort of imperfect one. This is, from one strike, just from the news outlets that were reporting what occurred on one strike site. And then, of course, witness testimony is always super important. Not just for details, but to provide the voice of the victims. Let me see if I can really quickly just show you in real time the website. It's unsrct-drones.com, and you should check it out later. But basically, this is just an example of how it works. The point is also to drill in. When I talk about resolution, it's not just a pixel I'm talking about. It's the idea that you're going from a large geopolitical, geographic context. And I think a lot of the work that's been done on civilian casualties tends to remain at that scale when you're looking at all of Fatah or all the casualties at once. But the idea here is to kind of drill in as much as you can. And of course, you all use Google Earth and and Bing, and you know how to drill in. That's the point here. And the other point, the kind of idea in general, and hopefully the promise of this type of work, is both that it can be updated. So once it's out there, as more information becomes available on the strikes that are already represented here, they can be updated and given more texture. And it also just the ambition, perhaps it's too much of an ambition, but that there's some sort of accountability that increases with this being available to a broader audience that might otherwise not read the PDF that Ben submitted at the General Assembly. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. So thank you very much for organizing this and having us all in this space. The place that I enter this conversation is also with digital landscapes, specifically the topography of the touch screen. I'm curious about those of us who walk down the street in an infinite scroll. what are the things we choose to be notified about in real time? Facebook, text messages, Snapchats. I can remember this moment right after everyone joined Twitter, walking down Broadway, seeing folks on their phones, and thinking, what are the landscapes these folks are least connected to? And by these folks, I mean me as well. At least on the surface, what are the spaces of exception that, for all intents and purposes, could not be further away? For me, there was this grand irony in the chasm between the fetishization of the real time, the always needing to be in the loop, and the way in which war was increasingly being prosecuted overseas remotely with many of its most technophilic taxpayers completely out of the loop. Secret wars, covert wars, out of sight, out of mind. In the same way that the United States has built warehouses for people, 5,393 carceral facilities constellating the country, many of which are constructed on far-flung landscapes that by design are hidden from public view. I think that there's a parallel to be drawn from the disappearing act that has been the US targeted killing campaign. I was curious about the landscapes that I didn't have to see. A predator drone in flight, a village in Al Jaff, the aftermath of a drone strike, a Hellfire missile with "in memory of the Honorable Ronald Reagan" written on the side, Nabila, who is Mamana's granddaughter, her self-portrait with 2 crayon drones circling above her house. I was curious about my own relationship to covert war. No matter how many Amy Goodman headlines I heard about so-called militants and drone strikes and aerial bombardments, I couldn't tell you in any granular detail what exactly was going on. 3,000 people died on 9/11. In the years since, as many as 4,700 people have been killed by drones. And that's just counting the secret ones in Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, and that's also not to say that counting isn't itself also a colonial legacy. Anyway, I started with this thing that everyone has in their pocket, which is the telephone. If this is where people are, then how do you meet them there? So I said I wanted to make an app. And I wanted it to be really simple. I just wanted to send you a push notification every time a US drone strike was reported in the news. So in the same way that a missile could come out of nowhere, a push notification can come out of nowhere, and it's not your friend texting you, it is something that's a bit more unsettling. It began from this question. Even if we have access to the data, do we really want to be interrupted by it, right? Do we really want to be as connected to our foreign policy as we are to our smartphones? Our phones, which are these increasingly intimate devices, right? The place that we share pictures of our loved ones and communicate with our friends, the things that we pull out of our pocket when we're lost, which auto-magically put us at the center of the map and tell us where we're going. Do we really want these things to also be the site of how we experience remote war? In an age when it's possible to sit in an air-conditioned room in Nevada or New Mexico and control an airplane as it hovers over a village in what used to be India, is there a way to close that feedback loop a little bit and actually feel something, even if it's just my pocket vibrating when the missile hits the ceiling? One problem, I didn't know how to make an app. So I learned how to make an app, and I submitted it to Apple, and they said, sorry, your app has been rejected. And they said that it was not useful or entertaining enough, that it did not appeal to a broad enough audience. And then on the third rejection notice, they said that it had excessively objectionable or crude content. And this was the rationale that I got for the fourth and fifth rejections as well. So the next thing I did was start a Twitter account. Said I was going to tweet the entire history of US drone strikes one by one, starting at the beginning. I also said that it was going to take 10 minutes to bear witness to this on a real-time platform. It took 5 months. Part of the reason it took so long is because the conversation that we've already begun, even though there's close to 500 reported drone strikes that have happened, there's not a lot of information. So you'll see stories like this, which ran 2 years apart, which are literally the exact same story. Instead of South Waziristan, it says North Waziristan. And there's a different number of missiles that were fired. But everything else is like a Mad Lib. Luckily, there is one of these organizations, BIJ, which I think that New America Foundation has since changed, but it's the one that exposes all of the links from which the data, so-called data, is being collected. And I hope that in the Q&A we can get into thinking about data and what data means, particularly when it's human data, particularly when it's coming from wire services, when it's really just kind of English language metadata. And so basically I went through their website, clicked on all these links, read them, tried to find some detail around which a mini narrative can be wrapped, and then distill it into a tweet and put it into a database. For my graduate thesis at NYU, I made what's called an API, which is an application programming interface, essentially so that you can put 2 lines of code in and have the whole historical archive and do something with it. That's not to say that I don't have a critique of the fetishization of data visualizations and our need to always show ourselves the same information over and over again. And I say that as someone who's done a few different projects around drone strikes. So yeah, I hope we can talk about that more too. I will shut up soon, I promise. This is what the database looks like. It's just JSON. You can use it to power a search function. So this is if you want to go back and actually look for a particular strike. You can see the reports. This is kind of thinking about the notion of blank spots in the data. If this is about people whose identities are not altogether known, how do you represent that information? So I wanted to hide each strike behind this blank tile with one of the kids who you may have seen an image of circulating in the last few days of her face. Anyway, I want to close with this one image because I think that it's particularly salient for today. This is Google Maps, and if you can see right there, it's an image of a drone. This is over Sana'a, where there have not been any drone strikes. But as of 2 weeks ago, this was still live on Google Maps. And I'm not sure what the blue spot is, but maybe we can talk about that later too. Anyway, that's it. Thanks.
I was starting to feel a little bit lonely sitting here by myself. So one point, and then I'm going to ask a couple of questions to our panelists. I think we should make clear here that a lot of this reporting that happens, and there are some exceptions to this, is done, as Josh just demonstrated, with open source information. Something like Google Earth is an incredibly powerful tool. And in fact, there are people who just spend hours and hours on Google Earth looking for evidence of the drone program. So it's kind of funny in a sense that data is such an issue in this time when we have access to investigative tools that are much more powerful than the normal human being has had at any point in history. And a lot of the statistics that I gave earlier are really just collated from news reports that anybody can Google and go online. Really anyone can do this work in a sense, although there are some exceptions where they actually have people in the field. So that's just something to think about. That being said, the question that I wanted to pose to some of the panelists is, in a sense, is it a difference for the lay person who's reading these reports whether we find that there have been 2,000 people killed or 3,000 people killed? Or is the real change going to happen when, as we see in each case, we develop some kind of a narrative? In that sense, does it really matter that we don't have access to perfect information about drone strikes? Is it really the story about Grandma Bibi that counts? And is it the narrative that we should be focusing on in terms of getting some public traction on this issue? Noreen, maybe you can.
Well, I'm of two minds. I mean, I'm a lobbyist for the ACLU, so I'm in the business of trying to get the U.S. government to change its policies on killing people and surveilling people and detaining them and all of those things. And in trying to make the case to the government, the most important thing for me to be able to show is that people like you guys actually care. And it's an interesting balance, because for Amnesty, we made a conscious choice to focus on the killing of this grandmother and the killing of a 14-year-old boy when we released our report. And by focusing on those stories instead of big numbers, we were able to break through the media conversation. So we got far more media coverage of these reports than we anticipated. It was unprecedented kinds of media coverage for Amnesty worldwide. And I think it was because of that message, a grandmother. And it's an indisputable kind of message. Numbers, especially when you can't put the faces by the numbers, play into the presumptions that we have about who lives in those places. And if you even look at the language of the media reports, like the CNN reports, right? What are the terms that are used? Compounds, vehicles, and then North Waziristan, which sounds like Wario or something. Like it's totally difficult for people in the United States and people in the UK to really grasp. But when you say grandmother and her grandkids watching, that really gets to people on a level that grabs a lot more public attention. But then on the other hand, you take the case to a member of Congress or to the White House and say, look, you killed this grandmother. The answer is, okay, even if we did, we're also killing thousands of bad guys. And I mean, that's the other thing at play here is the language of militants and bad guys, and the fact that these are words, completely meaningless terms, vaguely legal terms that are used like militants. When we talk about who's being killed, ends up obscuring the urgency of finding out those people's identities. So for the administration and for members of Congress, the question really is, who are the thousands of people who have been killed? If we could show that thousands and thousands of people have been killed wrongly or illegally, that there's thousands of grandmothers, then that might change the way this Congress thinks about the issue. But what they have are numbers. They do have numbers. They have numbers from the CIA, which runs most drone strikes, not the US military, right? It's mostly an intelligence, a secret spy agency killing people around the world. And they have those numbers against Amnesty's numbers, or Amnesty's one grandmother. And in that way, it does come down to the numbers. And they're numbers that we'll never have. Though I should just mention that last week, a member of Congress introduced a bill that would require the administration to provide its numbers, which is, I think, a pretty big step, but I'm biased because I wanted that bill very badly.
And Brad, would you say that in terms of creating this platform and in terms of the work that Forensic Architecture did, in terms of putting together a sort of visual representation or visual reconstruction of each strike, is that an attempt to enrich the data somehow, to make it more valuable to the researcher, or is it a way of communicating it, making it more accessible?
Yeah, I think there's two ways to answer that. At the most basic level, you have this kind of confluence between a covert program and a very remote part of the world. And I think we often resign ourselves to the fact that we can know very little. And that kind of resignation, I think, whether it's willful or just passive, just results in a certain type of complicity a lot of the time, that we can't know more. So at a very sort of fundamental level, the ambition is to say, yeah, in fact, perhaps we can know more if we begin to put the pieces together in a different way. And I think it's too early for us to say what the efficacy of the work is. It just came out recently. So, but I think we can point to certain things where we're at a very basic level, we can identify strike sites where people who are actually working, and incredibly smart people who are working on these issues for a very long time, are just overwhelmed and didn't have the time to say specifically where the site was. But through cross-referencing different types of information, we can begin to get more and more specific. And it's not about, well, I should say, yes, visual language does tend to reach a broader audience, right? It does make it more accessible. Some people might be seeing it, and hopefully a lot of people would be seeing it that otherwise wouldn't be involved in the discourse. But I think, in addition to that, there's the sort of analytical potentials for how to use spatial information, which we're trying to leverage. So, sort of on the most basic level, it's about demonstrating there's the potential to know more. Yes, on the visual level, it reaches a broader audience, but then also, I didn't get into this tonight because there wasn't time, but some of the more involved digital modeling and satellite analysis begins to become more analytical as well.
Perhaps there's a tension here in that we're starting to identify between two of the methodologies, where in terms of some of Brad's work, it's about attracting people to the data, saying, actually, this isn't so impenetrable. You don't have to sit down, as we at the Drone Center often do, and sort of, fill up a cup of coffee and, really get into the PDF report and find out what the information is there, which can be tiring at times. Getting the online platform is a little bit easier. So I appreciate that. And on the other hand, we have Josh's work, which is interrupting our lives. It's saying, no, you can't be indifferent, right? Bringing the data into our own pockets. Is there a tension between those two methodologies? Do you take a cynical approach to the idea of trying to advertise, I guess, data in a way that's more sort of palatable?
In some ways, the thesis of my projects has been, it's been kind of the opposite of the project. Like, I made the app because I didn't think anyone would download it, right? Like, I don't think people really want to subscribe to these types of alerts. Just like I started the Twitter account because I didn't think anyone would want to follow it. And I think that there's the big misconception, right, that if you have access to the facts, the data will set you free. And I think that is false. I think that the way that we make sense of the world is through narrative. And I think that that's actually the only thing that has ever changed me in my life, is a narrative. And so in some ways I've been like playing in this space of meta-narrative, right, where the narrative is the counting. I met somebody who I had not known except for on the internet, and she was like, oh yeah, I know you because you count things on the internet. And I was like, I guess the purpose of counting these things on the internet is to show that I actually can't count them. And I'm not sure what that means, but I don't think that when I hear 2,000 or when I hear 3,000 or when I hear 5,000, it does much for me. But when I hear somebody speak about their lived experience, it does something for me.
I want to pick up on that point because I think it's a really important one. I feel like we're perhaps, hopefully, emerging from a period of time where the fetishization of the quantitative is kind of on the downward trend. There's certainly a huge tension between qualitative and quantitative types of reporting. I think, for example, like Human Rights Watch hired its first statistician ever a couple years ago, and I think that says something about the direction they were leaning. But I think the point is that the disciplines tend to be siloed. A report that's about data tends to be about data. But to get at the kind of, to do the deepest dive, to find out as much as you can, it's never going to just be about one thing, right? And so I feel like the goal is to be able to bring the narrative, not just for the human component, but because it enriches our understanding of what occurred, to be able to leverage the data where it's useful, and to do it all in the same place, and to be able to come to our own decisions, either as analysts, reporters, the general public, et cetera, but to refuse to be kind of in these silos. Yeah.
And Noreen, I mean, where do you think an organization like Amnesty International stands, I guess, on that sort of tension?
I think we're desperate to get things to change, and I think both of these efforts are incredibly important. I was just thinking that Senator Dianne Feinstein from California is one of the most influential people on this issue. And she was saying a couple of weeks ago at a congressional hearing about domestic drones in the US that she wanted them to be regulated because she recently saw a drone outside of her window and it really bothered her, which is so painful considering the drones that under her watch have been, not outside people's windows, but destroying their homes and their families. I wish that you could get into her phone and get your app going in there and, just completely disrupt her existence. And I wish I could get members of Congress to sit, with your data. We're dealing with a overwhelming complacency and presumption of good with the Obama administration and with Western governments generally. That data, that narrative, all of it serves to disrupt. It obstructs the cheerful narrative of killing the terrorists and going onward towards our hope. And I think that we can't have just the stories like the quote, the testimony that I read you. It doesn't really go far enough because ultimately people have bigger questions, especially policymakers, about overall what's happening. And for that, I think the biggest problem is that Amnesty couldn't get behind necessarily like what the Bureau of Investigative Journalism is doing because we can't interrogate all of that data. We have we can't put forward anything unless we are quite sure that it really did happen. And we probably talk about it more, but the reports, the news stories are so flawed. They're relying on Pakistani military officials to confirm the number of people killed. They're relying on local witnesses who might have been intimidated by the Taliban or by other armed groups. And we're talking about a part of the world where the US presence is incredibly politicized and people are really angry about it for a lot of different reasons. So there's a huge amount of propaganda, including about the US killing, there's a High Court of Peshawar in Pakistan, a decision that says, the vast majority of drone strikes have killed mothers and suckling babies. And there's just hyperbole, and it goes far beyond what is actually the case. So we just have to be really, really careful with the data, which is why I think it's so important, what both of you guys have been doing.
So going off that, I want to maybe push you on a point, Noreen. This idea of secrecy, people talk about the drone strike program as being a secret program, and yet as you've seen, we actually know a great deal about it. Maybe we don't have the most accurate information about it, but we do know that these things happen. We do know that people are killed. We know that buildings are destroyed, and we know that sometimes civilians die. So the whole idea of secrecy really is a fallacy, perhaps. And so really, what is the benefit, I guess, of having the U.S. government? And I'm sure there is a benefit. In every single report, at the top of the recommendations, it will say the U.S. government needs to come clean, to disclose information. Is it a question of, I guess, that seeing the U.S. government say, okay, guys, we've killed 150 civilians, do we have to hear it from their mouth in order to sort of move forward? Or is there something to be said for trying to sort of, do with what we actually already have, which is quite a lot, even though there are these problems, but these problems are going to be sort of inevitable in any contentious issue that we look at.
Yeah, it goes to your theory of change. If you don't have accountability for human rights violations, I think that you can expect the perpetrators to continue to conduct them. A few weeks ago, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, the Senate voted to declassify a report on torture of people that occurred under the Bush administration. So we know that hundreds of people were tortured, that the CIA destroyed the tapes that they had made of them torturing people. And then we have that same agency that is put in charge of killing people globally outside of public view. And then we have the same intelligence community that is in charge of surveilling people around the world and has unprecedented access to every single person's phone, computer, this room right now. Because when we talk about secrecy, we're not just talking about do we know that these abuses have occurred. Obviously, we know that surveillance and killings and torture have happened, but secrecy is a stand-in for obstructing accountability. No one at the CIA ever had to pay for what happened. So if you were a part of the CIA, why wouldn't you think that you couldn't just keep on doing it? They continue to commit abuses with, it's the word that we use a lot, is impunity. Impunity happens because we never stop and force them to admit that they did it, and then they never take any kind of punishment, even from the public necessarily, and it just keeps on going, and it's almost like whack-a-mole for a human rights advocate, from abuse to abuse. So that's why I think we call for an end to the secrecy, because it's a start to accountability.
And maybe Josh and Brad, to talk a little bit about methodology. There's no secret with you, Josh, as to what you're trying to accomplish here. You're trying to point out that this is a flawed program, that this is a program that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, is evil, right? That there is some amount of evil in the idea of, a drone strike program, which is, I don't want to be too contentious in liberal New York City crowd, but that's not something that everyone believes. Trust me, we work with a lot of people who think that the drone strike program is a great thing. But in terms of reporting, is it problematic that your sort of take on the policy gets in the way at all? Do you think that that's true? Is there anything to be said for that?
I'm hesitant about the word evil, mostly just because I don't have a great definition of it, and so I'm not sure what I would mean if I were to say that. I'm interested in definitions of secrecy that are not just what you do or don't get to know, and that have more of a material element to them. One of the reasons that I love Trevor Paglen's work is because I think he really takes this seriously, the idea of secrecy being a material reality that is sculpted by human beings. And so looking at buildings and infrastructure and the places that the invisible world intersects the visible world. And I think that the news reports about drone strikes that say 42 people were sitting outside of a bus depot the same year that John Brennan says that there has not been a single civilian casualty, is one of those places where the visible and the invisible intersect. And so I am drawn to the project, I think, in some ways because of that. In terms of letting it get in the way, I think really what I'm trying to do is just make sense of it for myself and chart a kind of geography of this program. And I mean that in more than just putting the place marks that I put on a map, but really trying to think about it. In order to think about where these strikes take place, you sort of have to understand more. And I'm sure you came into this too. Is you have a different understanding of the political geography of Yemen or of Fatah. Like, just I hadn't really looked in a very granular way at the map of Yemen before. And so learning the names of different provinces and very small things make it a little bit less secret. And then you're like, oh, you can zoom in and see lots of things on, when you can pull out your phone and see through satellites. It's kind of crazy. That may not be getting to your point, but yeah, in terms of letting my politics get in the way of data, I don't know. I think about, well, I'll shut up in a second, I promise. But one last thing is, when I started tweeting all of these drone strikes, I used the word civilian at the beginning. And about halfway through, I was like, I'm not really sure what I mean by that or what is meant by that, because to not use that word implies something about all these other people that I actually don't really know anything about. And if you hear drone operators talk about how you can see a person, but you can't tell if it's a rifle or a baguette, I think it's difficult to make those sorts of adjudications for me.
And maybe just a little backstory on the question of what counts as a civilian. There was an uproar a couple of years ago when it was revealed that in the United States government's tallies, if there's a military-aged male in the vicinity of a drone strike and that male is killed, he's not counted as a civilian. he's counted as a combatant. So you're right that the question of being a civilian or not is very, very complicated, and the language that we choose is very complicated as well. Brad, what do you want to see happen with the platform now? What is this sort of an archival piece? You want people to keep returning to it, or is it just a way of transferring that information sort of in the moment?
No, I mean, the hope is that it's a living vehicle in the sense that, you know, it can be updated, it can be refined, it could be, you know, governments. One of the Ben's kind of conclusions was the call for governments to provide any and all information they have on strikes that they may not have already. So if that were to happen, it could be easily incorporated and updated onto the site, including the U.S. government. And I think that's where, you know, with eyes on it, that's where not only the potential for figuring out, you know, counting the number of civilians that died, making that determination, but to come back to a point that was made earlier, the fact that it then, you know, not our platform in particular, but accountability in general begins to structure behavior. And this idea of transparency, so anything that can be done to increase the amount of accountability, I think, is kind of the ambition of what we're doing. And so doesn't stop with the report, but it's built in a way to allow any and all information to be incorporated and updated. And we'll see how effective it is. But I also just want to make another point, which is that I think this binary between evil and something else is dangerous. And it's not the way I think about this. I don't even really think we're talking about drones, actually. I think we're talking about extrajudicial killing. I think we're talking about territoriality. I think we're talking about international law. And, you know, the technology will come and go, right? This technology has forced a debate and discourse around certain issues that are really important issues. And I think that's also one of the more interesting results of Ben's report is not necessarily, and it's actually quite inconclusive. I think places like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch probably were pretty disappointed in how inconclusive it was in its stated ambition of figuring out what happened with 30 strikes. But it does call into question the need to sort of think about what we mean when we talk about the ability of states to unilaterally kill people somewhere very far away, and what that means for questions of imminence and other international law. And so I think that's actually what we're talking about in some ways, and what needs to be addressed specifically.
So maybe with that we can see if anybody in the audience has a question for our panelists. So we'll take a couple of questions and sort of see how it goes. Yeah, you in the front.
Maureen, can you speak a little bit to the basic legality or illegality of these U.S. drone strikes abroad? What's the status quo on that international law?
Do you want to take a couple of them, or do you?
Oh no, let me do one by one.
Okay. So I used to be a law professor, so I'm going to but I'm going to just avoid all of that. And essentially, when we're talking about international law, there's international human rights law that applies everywhere, and then there's the laws of war that apply only in the situation of armed conflict. So I mentioned before, an armed conflict was happening in Afghanistan. But in Pakistan, is there an armed conflict? The US would say, yes, there is an armed conflict. We're in a global armed conflict with Al-Qaeda and its associated forces. And that global armed conflict is kind of boundless in territory. It could be anywhere, and it is boundless in time. It's just going to continue. And under the Obama administration's theory of armed conflict, everyone is either a civilian or a combatant. And if you're a combatant, then you can be directly targeted. And if I'm a combatant, and these three people are killed, but I'm Osama bin Laden, then under the laws of war, it might still be lawful for them to be killed, even though they were civilians, because they are considered collateral damage, and that's where that term comes from. But if we're outside of an armed conflict, if we're in parts of Pakistan where there is no armed conflict, or let's say that we're in the Philippines, where the administration might say there's global armed conflict, but most of us would say there's not an armed conflict. and I'm directly targeted, and these 3 people are killed. First of all, these 3 people being killed who posed no danger to the United States, they did not pose an imminent threat to the United States, they were just people, that would be unlawful. And now let's talk about me. Let's say that I was trying to provide funds to Al-Qaeda. I actually sympathize with their cause, and I want Al-Qaeda to succeed in some part of the world. Can I be lawfully targeted? Am I actually participating in some way? The US might still say yes. They might say I pose an imminent threat to life, and there's no alternative, and they have got to take me out and kill me. But most of us would probably say, just by providing funds, I'm not posing an imminent threat to the United States. And if the US wanted to, instead of killing me with a drone strike, they could capture me, and they could prosecute me, and then, pursuant to a fair trial, they could sentence me for material support to terrorism. So the answer to the question first depends on if you're in an armed conflict. But second of all, it depends on what was talked about, this idea of an imminent threat. Under international human rights law, you can only use lethal force in response to a truly imminent threat where there is no alternative, where it's a last resort. And the question in these cases, why it's not so simple, why Ben Emerson's report doesn't really come out and say, in these 30 cases, there was an unlawful killing, is because these inquiries are really fact dependent. And again, it's not like torture. It's not like we can say it's always wrong, period, move on. It's a lot more complex than that. Yet at the same time, the underlying issue is that the onus is on the US government to establish the legality of any of these strikes. And here's where the secrecy comes in again, right? When Ben Emerson puts forward 30 cases, or when Amnesty puts forward 9, the administration has an obligation under international law to investigate these allegations and to provide information about them. And the administration has failed on both counts. And in that way, I think, personally, it has violated international law.
Great. Do we have anyone else? Yep. Right back in, if you could try and speak up so everyone can hear you.
I have just a question to know if there is any other country that is known to start developing the same technology. And somehow the question is related to international law, because I guess that the drones exist because of there are armed conflicts, or there are conflicts with several countries, but also the infrastructure that makes the drones fly might be related, I assume, with satellite or satellite images that go over countries or that belong to different countries, so that they have a complex legislation. So if there is any information, if you have any information about other countries initiating or entering the dispute for these technologies.
Maybe I can speak about that, because at the center we do look at drone proliferation. It might come as a bit of a surprise, but there are just under 100 countries now that are developing military drones in some way or another. And that ranges from countries like the United Kingdom that have developed extremely capable drones, that have launched missiles from drones, that maintain a fleet of US weaponized drones that are capable of killing people, through to a country like North Korea that recently flew a drone into South Korea. The drone broke for some reason, and it fell to the ground, and it actually turned out to be not that more complex than some of the drones that my friends own. It really wasn't that impressive, and yet a similar one that crashed a few months ago was actually able to get pictures of the presidential palace in South Korea before crashing on its way home. This is, the question of sort of satellite infrastructures is very much related to the issue, because while a country like North Korea may have aspirations to own a Predator-like drone, the Predator being one of the more famous US, weaponized drones that carries out a lot of these killings, they don't have the satellite infrastructure. One thing I will say to that, though, is that there are all sorts of interesting questions about the different countries that the US specifically relies on for its targeted killing program. Recently, a former drone pilot by the name of Brandon Bryant came out and said that a base in Germany was supporting the drone strike program. It was a US base in Germany, I should make clear, by sort of acting as a waypoint for the data that was going between Nevada, where drone operators are sitting in their trailers, and South Asia and the Horn of Africa. And that raises all sorts of questions about whether that country permits it, whether that is in some way a violation of that country's popular sentiment in that country, in a democratic country like Germany, whether that's allowed. And obviously it wasn't passed by referendum, it wasn't really passed by anyone. This is a US base. So there are a lot of complex issues there, and I do urge you all to think about how those infrastructures that enable drone warfare sort of play into it. That's me geeking out, I'm sorry, on the sort of drone center stuff. It's stuff we're looking at right at this moment. Are there any other questions? Yes, certainly.
Yeah, this was really great. I just wanted to go back to, I think, something that Bradley said towards the end about, technology will come and go, but these are questions about territorialization and also just creating disposable populations and stuff. But mix it up with what I think Josh, in the beginning of the presentation, you almost like gave us a warning about visibility. And like, I thought we're talking about like invisibility and visibility, but there's also hypervisibility. And precisely around the prison system and the prison complex, we know how hypervisibility is also very productive in creating these threats. Like for instance, like how cops was like the very platform through which like we get to create certain identities that then rationalize the idea of holding folks away in these far places. So I guess like, is there a way that data itself and its tendency to produce certain forms of knowledge that can also validate the destruction of lives? Like, is there also this danger that maybe the visual and visibility may not always just be a kind of opening to a public, but that public itself may be complicit in accepting that those lives need to be destroyed as well? I guess I'm not really convinced totally that data, visual, public die. And I was wondering if you could speak more towards that, the visual part and the visible part.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. I think the premise for now is that we need to kind of pry the door open. We need to be able to like create a vehicle where you could just dump in as much as you can. What the outcomes of the varied outcomes of that process are may split and become detrimental at some point, may enable, but I think the foundation for what we're trying to do right now is to just make as much available as possible and to be able to actually get the different types of visual information to talk to each other, to be able to cross-reference information. In order to be able to do that, you have to create a platform where, I use the word platform literally, but also kind of more metaphorically, to present the material to make the inferences from one to the other. So, point taken. I think it's probably at this point, we're dealing with a covert program and we're dealing with this incredible effort to get information out there. So I think it's not that it hasn't been a sort of a thought or an issue for us so far, but it certainly could be. I just want to make one more point about the previous question as well. There was an article, I think his name is Connor Friesdorfer, in The Atlantic, which on the heels of the Emerson report, which made a really good point, which is that this is a technological question in some ways, and it's not a particularly complex technology as things go. And the debate we're having now anticipates the application of international law and the precedents and the kind of norms that will be brought to bear in the future as drones proliferate and are leveraged and are used by more and more countries. So I think, yes, we're talking about the US, yes, we're talking about the CIA's application of drone warfare, but if you anticipate the proliferation of this technology, you're also talking and setting precedents for the future.
Just to jump in on those last two questions, connecting the sort of the question of the future of drones and other nation states with this hypervisibility piece. Just thinking forward, I think the future of these sorts of drones, and you may be better suited to speak to this than anyone, is a solar-powered drone that can be hanging up there for a year or two without coming down, and will have a very high-resolution camera on it that can watch over an entire medium-sized city and go back in time and look and identify the various hyper-visible, more disposable bodies And if you read the white paper that Facebook put out 2 weeks ago, it's the same sort of thing of, oh, we're going to be able to beam network access to places that currently don't have internet with drones that are going to be at 65,000 feet because it's above the legislated airspace. And I imagine there will be a nexus of giving people internet and connecting the world with also having a camera that can be accessed by law enforcement. And I think that those two things will intersect in a really interesting way.
So let's just take one more. Who's that lucky person? Yeah, maybe you.
There's something I think that's not being maybe discussed. I think since all of you are here, I think there's like a special sauce that I think Noreen was talking about, where it comes to policymaking and lobbying, but also design and creating these modes of information to then display and share with lawmakers and policymakers. And I'm just wondering, like how do you anticipate that special sauce coming together to make that actually come to life? And where do you see kind of like the bulwark or the barriers that happen to making that actually exist?
This one for me.
Yep. No one else wants it.
Gosh, we're so behind in technology in like the halls of Congress. To imagine somehow to get a member of Congress to sit down with either an app or this website and see it. It's just we're not even close to that. I mean, they all carry around iPads, but do they know? That they're incredibly intelligent people, but it's just that we're just not there yet. But here's the thing: is that I really do think that for most administrations, for this administration and the past administration, where we've seen the most change on issues has been in response to public attention. For the CIA, they are incredibly vulnerable to negative publicity, and that what these technologies do is influence people who actually can scare the hell out of people in Congress. Like, there's nothing a person in Congress cares more about probably than not getting reelected. So I think we have to try to influence them, not directly, but indirectly through other people. And then the story, then the person like me can amplify what's being done here. But then I think the other question is, how do we get it out to more members of the public, right? Like, that app not being accepted by Apple is so incredibly depressing, right? That Apple will accept all these stupid apps that don't do anything, but it's just censoring essentially that information. And I would put that question to you guys: how we do that?
I think it's actually, you touched on a really important point. I think it's on the designer to approach the policymakers, the people working in human rights, lawyers, who are, in my experience, extremely receptive to this type of work, but wouldn't know to ask for it in some cases. Wouldn't necessarily know how to use a modeling software or which remote sensing data to use. But to go in and make a presentation at Human Rights Watch or make a presentation somewhere and show them what can be done, then it's a long process, but it leads to a series of discussions about what are they working on right now. I'm working on a case in Syria. It would be great if you could help me do this or that. We have these detention centers we've been trying to model. Or just one example, this is an example of something happened at Human Rights Watch. We had this conversation. They said, we just want to show how many bodies fit in detention centers of different sizes. Yeah, we can model that for you in a day, no problem. So I think it's the designer going and starting the conversation that otherwise might not happen, and seeing where those conversations lead. But in my experience, that's how things get started, and people have been very receptive and generous with their time and thoughts.
Great. So what I'll say is, to wrap things up, I guess, is we're at a very important moment in this issue. We're at the end of the first decade of drone use. What happens in the next decade is probably going to be even more incredible and transformative and challenging. And it really depends, I think, on the public being informed. And the three people that you have in front of you are the three people who are at the forefront of doing that. So, the onus, I guess, is on you and us to be better informed. And while yes, we can use things like DroneStream and the C2 platform, it's also just a question of seeking out and demanding better data. But the main priority right now actually is just to join us for a glass of wine and to all decompress a little bit. Please, come and say hi, and we can maybe continue the conversation a little bit. But join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for tonight.